This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. As we approach the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I welcome back the founder of Lifeline Ukraine and journalist Paul Niland to the Win Happy podcast. Make no mistake, this is a brutal war with endless pointless suffering, and Paul, an Irishman living in Kyiv for the last 21 years, tells the story of the last 2 decades in Ukraine and how he sees things going right now. Ukraine needs all of the help it can get to defeat Putin, and in the meantime we need to support all of the Ukrainians living in Ireland while they live through this ongoing nightmare. While things are beyond tough, Paul says the Ukrainian spirit will prevail, and they will be celebrating a victory against Putin's Russian army one day. Let's hear from Paul. Paul Niland, a huge welcome back to the Win Happy podcast. It's great to see you again, Paul.
It's always good to chat with you, Greg. Thanks very much for having me on again.
You're so welcome, and I can easily make an assumption that all of my guests know exactly who you are because you've been on a few times already. But for those who haven't and who are hearing you for the first time, I just wanted to tell that story very, very quickly. You've been living in Kyiv for about 22 years?
21, yeah.
It's 21 years. And what brought you there?
Ukrainian friends. I knew a Ukrainian family. I still know them to this day. They're lovely people, and they repeatedly invited me to come and visit. And I'd been to Russia a couple of times, and I just thought it's basically going to be the same. And on the very first day that I was here, it was a Sunday. It was in January, and it was cold. And I took a walk around and realized just what an incredible city this is. But also it was the demeanor of the people that struck me. Like they are definitely not Russians. They are not the same as Russians at all. Actually, that's one thing that I want people to know. Do you know the astonishing thing about Kyiv is just how European this city is? The people, the fashions, the cars, the stores, everything. This is the most normal European city that you would ever come across.
Yeah, it's quite strange that you say that because a number of years back I went to Budapest because I'd never been to Russia or Ukraine or anything like that, and that was my first experience of something that felt very, very grey and communist. Mm-hmm. You know, it felt like a backwater. The people you'd walk past in the streets, the things that you'd see in the shops, it felt like something that was 30 years minimum behind the rest of us, you know.
And, you know, many parts of Central Europe that were a part of the Warsaw Bloc, who were a part of, you know, the post-World War II order and who had communism forced on them, you know, their growth was retarded for decades as a result of having been subjected to that post-World War II order, sadly.
And tell me, you know, at that point when you came to Kyiv for the first time, what was your stock and trade? What was your profession? Where were you working from?
I was a financial advisor at the time. I used to work with high net worth individuals and design and manage investment portfolios for them. And I was chatting with a guy. He became a very good friend of mine, and he was in real estate. And he said to me one day, he said, "What do you know about real estate investment funds?" And I said, you know, I know how they fit into somebody's portfolio depending on their profile, their age, net worth, et cetera, et cetera. I said, what do you want to know? And he says, I want to know how to build one. I want to know how to create a real estate investment fund for Ukraine. And I said, that I don't know, but I'll look into it. I'll do some research and I'll find out. And then he and I ended up creating a partnership and attempting to launch the first real estate investment fund for Ukraine. And I remember there was one point, I mean, you're working with lots of different investors and you have, you know, expressions of interest. And you're trying to pull all these threads together so they come, you know, more or less at the same time. And then Vladimir Putin turned off the gas to Ukraine while we were trying to do this. And every single one of these investors turned around and said, looks like Ukraine's too dangerous a place for us to invest. And I simply replied to each of them, this is not Ukraine's fault. And if there's a sign from this about what is a dangerous place to invest, it's Russia. Russia is a dangerous place to invest. But anyway, it is what it is. I ended up then moving into commercial real estate as a profession for a while. And that ended in 2008 with the financial crash. But I was in a decent position and I bought some publishing assets and ran a publishing company for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so I imagine, Paul, identifying the commercial opportunities that were in Kyiv, you obviously saw the potential in the country. It was a country that was looking towards progressing, a bit more Western, as you said, very, very progressive. So it was potential at that point in time. And obviously that crash in 2008 that affected everywhere, obviously made you change course a little bit. So you've been living here. You were living here at that stage, and you were obviously flexing your career and everything else according to circumstances. I know today, the day that we're actually recording, the 18th of February, is an important date in Ukraine history. Mm-hmm. So it's the 10-year anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity. So a lot of the conversations that we have in the West and our knowledge of Ukraine and everything else, we all think this was something that started 2 years ago. Can you remind the listeners why today's date is so significant?
So 10 years ago today was when the Revolution of Dignity entered into its final stages, and there had been an agreement. One of the things that Yanukovych had done through a series of actions, including bribing the Constitutional Court judges and so on, was it concentrated more and more power in the office of the presidency. And Parliament on that day, on the 18th of February, was supposed to consider a bill to reverse some of those changes that had granted so much power into Yanukovych's hands. And when the order of the day was published and no such item was there, people marched towards the Parliament. And what ensued throughout the entire day was street battles, pitched battles being fought along a street called Institutskaya. At one point, I was on a crossroads. There's a street called Shokovitska, and the crossroads between Institutskaya and Shokovitska, which was a block away from the Parliament building. All of those roads to the Parliament, they were blockaded by military trucks, and the protesters had set them on fire. And there were teams of guys that were launching volleys of stones over these trucks at the riot police that were behind them. And those stones there were paving stones that were being broken up with sledgehammers, and they were being passed along with human chains. Much of the human chains were made up of women, in actual fact. And so these guys would throw volley after volley after volley over the burning trucks. And I ran into a friend of mine, and he said to me, "Paul, get out of here." He says, "There's thousands of them." Musa, as he called them, which is the Russian-Ukrainian word for rubbish. And I said, "Yeah, but they're behind the burning truck." And he says, "They're going to pull these out of the way, and then they'll storm through, and there will be thousands of them." And I said, "Okay, well, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And when I was talking about that crossroads, there was a riot police officer who was on the roof of it. I think it was a 5-story building, or is a 5-story building. And he was shooting down at the protesters. It was only buckshot, ball bearings, but even so, that's live rounds, live ammunition being fired into crowds of people. And the battle to get up to the roof space through the entrance to the building was pretty intense. And the Molotov cocktails going off everywhere. And it was a brutal day. There was a lady who died that day. One of the things that the authorities did was they closed down the metro. And there was a lady who was running from a baton charge from the riot police, and she tried to get into the metro station, but the doors were closed. Ludmilla was her name. I think she was 76 years old. And they beat her to death with truncheons in the doorway to the metro station. The barricades that had previously existed were stormed through by the riot police. There were new barricades that were made and that were set on fire. It was brutal day of street battles. But Greg, one of the things that I do, as you well know, is that I'm a journalist. And with great pride, one of the outlets that I've written for over the years is the Atlantic Council. And a few years ago, the editor of the Ukraine Alert section at the time, Melinda, she contacted me and she said, Paul, write something about the end of the revolution. And I said, you know what? I don't want to write about the 18th and I don't want to write about the 20th. The 20th was the day when lots and lots of people were shot and killed, when the Yanukovych authorities broke out the machine guns and the snipers were on higher ground and shooting at people. But I said to her, what I will write about is I'll write about the 19th. So the 19th, the day sandwiched between these two brutal days, was inspiring because on the 18th, there was a building that was like a headquarters for the revolution. The press center was there. It was a hospital. It was a feeding station. People were, dropping off warm clothing for anyone to collect and all that kind of stuff. And that building went up in flames that night. The authorities burnt it down, killing several people inside who couldn't escape from the fire. But the 19th was a day of rebuilding, and all over Maidan, new medical points sprang up. People were, bringing whatever they could. There were new field kitchens opening up. There were, people bringing reinforcements for the barricades, be it, pieces of wood or car tires or whatever it was. The 19th was an exceptional day, and then the slaughter that happened on the 20th is one of the darkest days in Ukraine's history. But it's also at the same time, do you know what motivates Ukrainians over the last 10 years to continue the process of reforming this country and fighting against corruption? It's those sacrifices that were made on the Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity. And, it was a high price to pay. 100 people died, all told. And many of my friends are anti-corruption activists. They, run some of the most important anti-corruption bodies here. And, that's what they always come back to. Like the price was that high that we cannot fail in this mission, because that was what ultimately triggered the Revolution of Dignity. It was an anti-corruption fight. I mean, the catalyst was when Yanukovych said that he wouldn't sign the association agreement with the EU, like days before it was due to be signed. 6 days in actual fact. He was supposed to sign it on the 27th of November in Vilnius, and on the 21st, that was when his government said that it wouldn't be done. So, the catalyst was the refusal to sign the association agreement, but really it was about corruption. And one of the things that had been consolidated here since the Orange Revolution was a free press. It was very important, and that's one of Yushchenko's main legacies, that historical identity, the Ukrainian language. There are several strands to Yushchenko's legacy, but the free press was one of them. And it was that free press investigating and exposing the corruption of the Yanukovych regime that had us all so angry that when on the 21st of February they said we're not signing the association agreement, we're like, okay, let's do something. And we did. It took 93 days. It cost 100 lives. But by God, what a fundamentally important period in the history of this country.
And back to you, Paul. My understanding is that you had a trip booked around that time. Mm-hmm. And you decided to change your plans when all of this was kicking off.
My son lives overseas. He was born here in Kyiv, but he's lived overseas for years. And when he was little, I used to fly down to go and see him every single month, right? Because as a young boy, it's a couple of weeks since dad's here or a couple of weeks until he comes, right? That was a period that he could get his head around, right? And he's not waiting too long. And he was here during the Revolution of Dignity. He was here over New Year. We spent New Year's Eve. We saw in the New Year on Maidan. And so he'd said to me at the beginning of February, he's like, Dad, it's more than a month since I've seen you now. And I said, okay, I'll book a ticket. I'll come down next weekend. And on this day, 10 years ago, with what had happened, I called him in the evening. I said, I have to change my ticket. Today has been, just the most terrible day, and I cannot leave right now. And the revolution actually ended on the 22nd of February when Yanukovych went into exile in Russia, and my then wife and I were among the very first of the protesters who went into the estate that he'd built for himself with all of these stolen billions. And a few days later, I went down to go and see my son, and I shut myself off from social media. I was having nightmares. I mentioned that the barricades were on fire. That was what I was seeing in my dreams, and there were traumatic events, and I needed to decompress. I needed to take some time for myself, and a few days later, when I went back to social media, I'm seeing what's already underway in Crimea and watching reporters just quoting Russia, saying Russia denies that these are their troops, and then it's a shrug emoji, isn't it? Who knows what to believe? Well, the golden rule is, you're a journalist. It's your job to find out the truth and to represent that. It was obvious that they were Russian soldiers from the get-go. Why anybody was saying Russia denies and just trotting out their lies was, a really one of those moments highlighting the failures of the press. And to some degree, they've got better. And we see it now in the reporting over the last couple of days on the assassination of Navalny. People are pulling no punches now, but back then it was he said, she said, and, quoting both, sides and just leaving people to come to their own conclusions. Well, that's not responsible journalism.
And Paul, for you, obviously Ukraine was in your blood at this stage. At any point, did you not think, Jesus, I'm out of here. This place is a shitstorm. I'm going to go back to a quiet life in Ireland or England or wherever?
There was one moment where I sat there in the evening and I said, to hell with this, I'm leaving. And it was after the Orange Revolution, because the Orange Revolution was also about Yanukovych. What happened was they tried to steal the election and pronounced Yanukovych as the winner. And people said, no, there is obvious fraud. There's, this is not an accurate reflection of the will of the people. This was, there was so much election fraud. And so, we went out on the streets. It was a shorter revolution than the Revolution of Dignity. It was more of a carnival atmosphere. It was less violent. But then there were parliamentary elections that came a few years after the presidential election that Yanukovych had tried to steal. And as a result of the parliamentary elections, Yanukovych was appointed prime minister of Ukraine again. And that day I said, nah, to hell with this. I just stood in a revolution. And again, it wasn't as intense as the Revolution of Dignity became, but at the time it was it was the most significant, event that I had participated in, right? And that man could come back to such a high position of power. That was one day when I said, to hell with this, I'm going. And then, the next day you wake up and you're looking at the realities of life. I had a small child. I had a business that was important to me, and okay, so I stayed, and I'm glad that I stayed, despite what we've gone through in the last 2 years of the full-scale invasion. This has been obviously extremely difficult. 2 years of outright war with these barbarian hordes. But I'm glad that I've stayed. This is my home. I consider myself having, participated in these monumental events that have shaped the country. I consider myself to be Ukrainian. My Ukrainian friends call me Ukrainian.
That's a real proof, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you said, you're a journalist. I would call you a political commentator, regardless of the platform. And more than that, you're the founder of Lifeline Ukraine. When did that happen? And what is Lifeline Ukraine?
Lifeline Ukraine is our national suicide prevention hotline. Ireland has had a suicide prevention hotline for 60 years now. People in the UK know the Samaritans. If you're dealing with some kind of emotional trauma, if you're having suicidal thoughts, then that's who you turn to. And in 2018, we had a acting minister of health at the time, Dr. Uliana Supran. She's an American Ukrainian, and she copied me on an email one day, and the email simply said, "Bring Paul Niland into the next meeting on this." Full stop. There was nothing else. There was no kind regards, nothing. Just bring Paul Niland into the next meeting on this. And so I went to the Ministry of Health And in 2018, I was presented with a document which was written by experts from Lifeline Australia, who Uliana had brought here, and she'd sought their advice on how we should set up a suicide prevention hotline for Ukraine. And in 2018, in June of 2018, I'm sitting in that meeting, and I pick up this sheath of papers, and I looked to the people in the room, and I said, the date there is the 12th of June, 2017. It's 12 months old. 12 months old. Why has nobody done this? And, the simple answer was that somebody needed to take responsibility for it. And so, over the next couple of days, I kind of weighed everything else that was going on in my life and decided that this is something that I could do, and this is something, therefore, that I should do. It's important in every country to have a suicide prevention hotline, to be there to provide emergency support for people and to save lives. And, we secured our first grant a year later in the summer of 2019, and we were operational on October the 14th of 2019, and we've been in operation ever since. And last month, for example, I was just looking at the statistics. They're not statistics; they're people. The number of instances of support that we provided last month was 3,362. And that's 3,362 people who called us in dark moments. And I'm a guy that organized the thing, right? I'm responsible ultimately for the organization, but it's my colleagues who are answering the phones, and we also provide support through chat messaging as well. And they're the people who are doing the heroic work of Lifeline Ukraine. They're the ones who in real time, day and night, are helping people out and saving lives. And it is, I've done some stuff in my time, but professionally, this is the pinnacle of my accomplishments, having created this and kept this organization going for now 4.5 years.
And what an unlikely person to end up, being handed with this challenge. You're the money man, the publisher. Like, I'm sure, day one when you set foot in Ukraine, on no planet could anyone have imagined or even whispered in your ear, this is what you're going to end up doing. This was not on Paul Niland's career plan.
It was definitely not my career plan. But again, when I realized that I could do it, I knew that I should do it. It was as simple as that. I had a meeting actually with somebody, like 2 days after the first meeting at the Ministry of Health. I had a meeting with somebody, a good friend of mine now, and he used to be the CEO of Lifeline Australia. And he explained something to me in that meeting. He said, in suicide prevention, we have what we call this golden window. He said, if you begin a crisis call with somebody who is, really in an awful emotional state, he said, if you're still speaking to them 15 minutes later, you can say that you've saved that life. And the impact that notion had on me, that you can literally save a person's life, and not just save that person's life, but then, save their extended family and, their loved ones, their friends from the heartbreak of losing that person to suicide. That was what convinced me to do this. That simple message, the 15-minute golden window. This, if there is the right support, you can save a person's life in 15 minutes. And later I came to understand why that is. And suicidal ideation it's a very emotional thing, right? But our instincts, which have evolved with us throughout the period of human existence, one of our most basic instincts is survival. And what you're doing in that period is you're helping that person while their emotions are subsiding, and their instinct takes over again. And so you get back to that point where the primary instinct is survival. And, that's the heart of the work that we do is helping people through those dark periods and helping them get back to a point where they feel more stable and they're in a safer place.
A few episodes back, Paul, the Win Happy podcast, I had a character on called Shane Craddock, and he was telling me his story. And there was a particular day when he went to the phone box, and he was working close enough to where I used to work. I think he was working for PepsiCo at the time. And he rang his mother, with the purpose of having a final phone call with her. It was to say goodbye. She wouldn't have known it was a goodbye phone call, but for him, it was a goodbye phone call. Mm-hmm. And he said, for whatever reason, whatever quirk of fate, it was his father, who happened to work for Smithwick's, the beer in Ireland, and the brewery. And it was his father who was home for some reason and answered the phone and detected something very, very unusual in his son. Okay, what's up? Why are you calling me on this particular day? And managed to squeeze it out of him over a little bit of a conversation that, there was something seriously wrong. But he was taking his own life that day. And he talks about that journey from that moment, and he got counselling and all that kind of stuff, and went on to do amazing things. Quid pro quo, that famous line that we all heard about between this idiot American president called Donald Trump and a character called Vladimir Zelensky, who was the president of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm going to be very honest with you. I think that was the first time that Ukraine came onto my radar. And I know we've had a big conversation about 2014 and all that kind of stuff, but I knew nothing about it. Even though I'm an avid social media user and I do read and I try to educate myself. So until that quid pro quo moment when Donald Trump was trying to bribe Zelensky, in other words, would you please give us some dirt on Hunter Biden and then we'll give you the aid that you need?
Yeah.
I think that was the first time Ukraine started to come onto our radar for a Donald Trump reason. And the characters that were around there, Zelensky, and then we were kind of led to believe that he was a bit of a joke of a character because he had been a comedian stroke actor. And then fast forward, and I'm having a conversation with you because Putin was threatening to invade Ukraine. There were, 250,000 forces just parked on your doorway, ready to invade, and we were having a big conversation. In your heart of hearts, when we had that conversation, did you actually think he was going to invade?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I had absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the invasion was coming. But at the time, what I said is, there's going to be a bloody, brutal expansion of the war that had been going on since 2014 in the East. And I said that what he would try to do was to grab the land bridge connecting Russia itself with occupied Crimea. And those things, that is how it has transpired. But I said, he's not going to come after Kyiv because that would be insane, right? To think that he could come to this city and that this city would be occupied by Russia. It was just unthinkable to me. But that's exactly what they tried to do. And it was the day one goal of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was to get into Kyiv, to decapitate the legitimate government and replace with a puppet controlled by Russia. And I want to. You know how certain sounds can take you back to a particular time, a particular event. The thing that always takes me back to the 24th of February is the sound of suitcase wheels rolling across paving tiles, because that was all I heard. And explosions, and it was what it was. But all the people evacuating on the 24th of February because he was coming, he was definitely. I mean, there's an airport on the outskirts of the city. It's the place called Hostomel. And that airport is actually it's the home runway of the Antonov aircraft company. And the Maria, the Dream, was the largest transport aircraft in the world. And that was where it was home. So obviously the runway there is enormous. And day one, the Russians flew in their special forces on attack helicopters, and for a while they held Hostomel Airport, and the intention was to put plane load after plane load after plane load of more Russian special forces with armored personnel carriers and everything else, and from there it would have been a short ride into the city of Kyiv itself. It was terrifying in the initial stages, being in Kyiv. But as I say, I believed that they would try to take the land bridge. I knew that there would be a big war in the east. We recognized places like Kharkiv were at risk and so on. But yeah, he came for Kyiv. Nonetheless, I had said before the full-scale invasion, whatever happens, I am not leaving. This is my home. And, that was what I said, and I stuck to it.
Yeah, and every one of those suitcases was a man, woman, child who all made a decision. I need to leave this country. I think they recognized the shitstorm, and they knew the brutality that was coming their way. There was no messing, and they had to get out. And of course, we ended up taking in a lot of Ukrainian refugees. That's a horrible word. Yeah, and like so many other countries. And we spoke a year on, Paul. We were all talking about a spring-summer offensive. Ukraine, suddenly you were amassing all of these arms and equipment and everything else from Europe and from the US. I'd nearly go as far to say we're optimistic about that phase of the war. Forces were being pushed back everywhere. There was bloody battles in so many of these city names that now we know all of them. We never heard of them before that. It's a little bit different today, isn't it?
It is different today. Wars are awful, awful things. They are just terrible. I wrote an article, I'm published most frequently by a newspaper in the UK called Byline Times. And I wrote an article in the summer of last year called Russia's War Addiction. And I said, war is a very unnatural state of affairs. It means that everything else has failed. Politics has failed, diplomacy has failed. All that's left is brute force. That would be the way that we think. But if you're Russian, all you've ever known for as long as Vladimir Putin has been in power has been war after war after war. It was the Chechen war, it was the Georgian war, it was their involvement in, well, first of all, the theft of Crimea, the invasion of the Donbass in 2014, which, again, the press got that badly wrong too. And for years reported on supposed separatists that had risen up against, the central government. It was always a Russian operation. It was always a Russian invasion in the Donbass. But Russia's war addiction that has seen them destroy large parts of Syria so that the tyrant Assad, his regime is also responsible for kidnapping and torturing people, killing them extrajudicially in detention. But Putin saw a fellow tyrant and intervenes so that he would not fall in a popular revolution, an uprising. And that is all that Russia knows. And I've also written for Byline Times as well, an analysis. I took the dictionary definition of fascism and I wrote, here is how Russia meets every single one of these criteria. Russia is a fascist state, and Russia is addicted to war. And we are currently the victims of their need for aggression. And it's not just Putin. It's not just the soldiers. It's society needs this aggression. It's what they live on. It's this hatred has been built into the wiring of their brains now because of years and years and years of propaganda. And that is why there is large popular support for the war, despite them having lost over 400,000 of their soldiers, right? The majority still supports the war against Ukraine. But if they're not stopped here and now, this fascist regime will go on and they will attack other countries as well. And if you look at their propaganda, which sadly I have to do, it's one of the things that informs my journalism and it informs my writing. You look at the number of times that they've talked about attacking, not just Poland and the Baltic states, but they talk about Berlin, Paris the day after. Literally, this is a repeat of Nazism. Vladimir Putin is as evil as Adolf Hitler was. And what Ukraine is stopping is World War III. And, when people argue about the cost of this war, think about the cost of what would happen if this war is not stopped in Ukraine now. And the war will be stopped in Ukraine. I have I have absolutely no doubt about this, and the vast majority of people in Ukraine are also united by this belief. Ukraine will be victorious. Ukraine will put a stop to this and will eject the Russian invaders from every square inch of the territory of this country as it is within its internationally recognized 1991 borders.
I think the world recognized that danger 2 years ago, and it pretty much reacted immediately. And it was unquestionable support for Ukraine, whatever you needed, US, Europe, etc.
Not quite, though. Sorry to interject. Not quite. We yes, unquestionable support because, black and white, good and evil, right? I mean, there are some people who live in a deluded fantasy land where they're on board with the whole idea that Ukrainians are Nazis, all that kind of rubbish, right? But the fact is that we have not received enough support. And by that, I mean, there's reports of 24 F-16s that should be on Ukrainian soil and a part of the Ukrainian continuation of destroying these monstrous hordes. But 24 F-16s in a few months from now, when we should have had them, like October the 10th of 2022. That was the date where Russia's tactics switched to bombing our critical infrastructure, the energy power plants. We then went into months and months of loss of power and then rolling blackouts while it was all being rebuilt and repaired. To me, that point then, October the 10th of 2022, when they started this deliberate campaign that would cause immense hardship to millions and millions of people throughout the country. That's the point that the West should have turned around and said, whatever Putin has said is a red line, whether it's the ATACMS missiles, whether it's, Patriot air defense systems, whether it's, the modern fighter jets that we need. That's the point, that all of those self-imposed restrictions on aid in Ukraine, that's when it all should have evolved. All should have evaporated. Send everything to Ukraine, and the more material that we have that can destroy the fighting capability of the Russian occupiers, the faster this war ends, right? So everything, send it all, and it should have been done long before yesterday.
I absolutely agree. And I think there was unquestioned support for Ukraine, but there was an argument that went alongside that you need to keep the bear at bay, but you don't poke the bear. And so if you went a little bit too far, you'd poke the bear and he'd hit the red button and there'd be nuclear destruction and all of that business. But that agenda now seems to have even more diluted. I told you I bumped into Micheál Martin at Christmas doing his little bit of shopping around Cork City. And at the time, the conversation was all about the EU supporting Ukraine. And I think it was Orban in Hungary who was causing trouble. And he assured me, don't worry, that will be sorted. And sure enough, that did happen. And now we've got this bullshit that's continuing in America. I think I'm correct that there's been no financial support since December 2023. And you've got the Republicans dancing to Donald Trump's merry tune and blocking support. Suddenly, it's a popular election political football to say enough is enough. We're not writing checks to support anyone outside of our country. And I was back and forth with my brother yesterday, last night, having a big argument that we have over and over and over. And he's sending me links to reports, polls by the Republicans. Half the Republicans don't want to support Ukraine. It's a waste of money. And what about all the issues at home and everything? So that's crept into things. I know the Senate have passed it. Now it's going to go to the House. In Ireland, with open arms, we welcomed Ukrainian refugees. Now, there's other refugees as well, and I think that those numbers keep on mounting up. I would say since the beginning of this year, there's a lot of loud voices around Ireland is full. And without a doubt, there were minority, right-wing nut jobs. But suddenly they started to put things on fire. You know, the little hotel that had been closed for a while. There's a client of ours, Paul, and try to get your head around this. They're after buying a beautiful, beautiful hotel that had been abandoned for a long time, a beautiful structure for whatever reason it hadn't been occupied. And it's up the country. And his plan is to reopen it, restore all of the original splendor and everything else so people can enjoy it again. And there's nearly a panic with him whereby he wants us to make sure that in no uncertain terms that the people in the locality know this is going to be a regular hotel. The purpose of it is to, have lovely functions and everything else and weddings and dinners and all that kind of thing. That it's not going to be a previously disused building that's now going to house Ukrainian refugees or refugees from other places. We're seeing this over and over and over. As well as that, we're seeing shifting sands in Ukraine. I think the head of the army was just changed quite recently. And there's a bit of rhetoric that comes around all of that, and you might kind of fill in the gaps for me there. And we've got the feeling big time that, everything over there, we've arrived at a huge stalemate. And have there been very, very recent losses by Ukraine? Was there a retreat from a particular city? So it just seems very, very different, both internally and externally at the moment.
The kind of arguments that are happening within Ireland, let's say, about not just Ukrainian refugees, but asylum seekers and immigrants in general, and the notion we're full is something that Nigel Farage has been banging that drum in Great Britain for quite some time as well.
It's disgusting. It's disgusting.
You can see it for what it is. It's racism. That's what it is. And I mean, after I left Ireland and my mother moved us to the UK, my mum was English, my father was Irish. So I was born in Dublin and then raised in the UK after my parents had separated. But we went to the West Midlands, which was where my mum was from, a place just outside of Birmingham called Walsall. And that was, back then in the 1970s, it was full of immigrants. It was a multicultural place. There were people from all corners of the world who had moved to the UK, and yes, there was racism at the time. I remember my grandfather using awful words to describe his next door neighbours because of their dark skin colour, right? I mean, but in the modern age, there should be no place for that. But that's exactly what it is. It's just thinly veiled in these arguments of we're full, we can't afford it, we have to deal with our own problems first, blah, blah, blah. The real problem is that you're a racist. You're a racist and you don't like people because they look different to you, right? And I mean, that's what it boils down to. The part about the debate in the US of Republicans and should Ukraine be supported and so on, the fact of the matter is that it's the arguments against Ukraine are based on lies and lies that have been put out and perpetuated and by people who should know better. I mean, if you look at the contortions, you mentioned that the Senate has passed the supplement, including $60 billion of aid to Ukraine, and it's gone to the House. And what has Speaker Johnson done? He sent everybody away on holiday for 2 weeks so that it couldn't possibly be voted on. I mean, that is obviously nakedly trying to sabotage aid to Ukraine, which is a fundamental, it's the largest part, this supplemental. But if you look at the ways in which over the last few months, the Republicans in Congress have acted, first of all, they said that they wanted a change to immigration policies, right? And then they got it. They got exactly what they were asking for. And then they said, no, we don't need that bill now. And then there was the next phase, next cycle of excuses. And now it's back again, and now they're saying again that they want to have it. We can't pass this without immigration reform. Well, you've been given it. You've been given it. But one of the things that I'm seeing in the last 48 hours since the murder of Alexei Navalny in a Siberian prison up in the Arctic, one of the things that people are saying is, as a clear sign to Vladimir Putin of you have gone too far, is the United States needs to pass that $60 billion of aid to Ukraine, and they need to do it now so that we can inflict maximum damage on his armed forces. And the other thing that people are saying, I was just watching Nigel Gould-Davis on CNN earlier on. He is a former British diplomat, including being the ambassador to Belarus. And the other thing is that there are frozen Russian assets in the amount of $350 million US, right? In no earth that I can imagine being a part of can that money ever be given back to Russia. It cannot be given back to Russia. Russia has clearly caused well in excess of that amount of damage to Ukraine already. The amount I read recently is estimated by the World Bank to be $476 billion worth of damages. So now, as a sanction, as a punishment on Putin for murdering Alexei Navalny in prison, it's a display of consequence that those frozen Russian central bank assets would be transferred to Ukraine, not only for the rebuilding of Ukraine, that can come from reparations, that will be an instrument that is going to be a permanent tax on Russian income from their hydrocarbon exports in the future. And negotiating what that looks like, that will come with the authorities that follow Vladimir Putin after he is either killed or ousted or imprisoned or sent to The Hague, whichever one of those outcomes is his end. It cannot come fast enough. But that $300 billion, let's use it right now in poetic justice to destroy the Russian military that it continues to pose a threat to Ukraine. The Czech president, Peter Pavel, announced yesterday in Munich that they found 500,000 155 millimeter artillery shells. We need those. And he said they can be delivered to Ukraine within weeks if we have the right funding. Right. Give Ukraine that $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. We'll buy those 500,000 155 millimeter shells, and we will drop them on every single Russian location, be it a logistics warehouse, a fuel dump, repair station for their tanks, or their barracks where there's large numbers of troops coalesced. Destroy everything, and destroy everything with their own money.
And Paul, that story about the changing of the guard, the changing of the military high command, and the spirit of the Ukrainian people around all of that, and there must be a lot of exhaustion on the front lines.
So yeah, there was a change of the top leadership of the military. The former commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, was very well respected throughout the country. He had a high degree of trust from the population. However, the head of state ultimately makes this decision, and Vladimir Zelensky decided that he would appoint somebody new to that post. There was a beautiful moment, actually, the day after the change happened, where Zaluzhny was given the highest honor, the highest state honor that Ukraine has, which is called the Hero of Ukraine Award. And as they were meeting for this ceremony, Zaluzhny approaches Zelensky, gave him a hug. He received his medal. They hugged it out again. I don't think there's bad blood between them. And I know somebody who knows Zaluzhny, and I had dinner with him a couple of days after that, and he told me that he'd spoken with him, and he seemed quite relaxed about what had transpired. And another guy that I follow on Twitter is Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and he did a tweet around the time of the replacement. It was either when it happened or when the rumors were that it was going to happen. And, he was talking about the exhaustion, the mental exhaustion of the people who are the decision makers at the top of a military structure and saying, you know what, give Zaluzhny now some time off. He's been through 2 years of full-scale war, and that's a good time to be putting someone else in charge. In terms of the recent withdrawal from a territory, the town that we're talking about is Avdiivka. And Avdiivka has been a frontline city since 2015. There has been fighting over Avdiivka for close to a decade already. In 2 years of full-scale war, where Avdiivka was the next step from occupied Donetsk, they've only just managed to take it. It was a town, and nobody had ever heard of it, right? The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has tweeted something out today about it being liberated. It's a town of 32,000 people. Nobody had ever heard of it. And this is now being presented as some kind of great shift in the direction of the war. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Ukraine has held on to places like Bakhmut, like Solidar, for example, until you get to a point where the Russian assaults on these places have destroyed everything there. And when they've destroyed everything there, and when almost all of the population has left there, there is nobody and nothing left to defend, right? So these places, these monumental battles that we've seen, the Ukrainian goal in continue to defend those places for as long as possible has been one thing only, and that has been to obliterate as much of Russia's armed forces as is possible. And, that having been achieved now over the last couple of years in Avdiivka, with particularly intense fighting over the last 5-6 months, fine. Now they withdraw to prepared lines of defense, and they'll wait for the next wave and continue to destroy 1,000+ Russian soldiers every day, as they have done for 5 of the last 6 days as well. The average for months has been 1,000 dead Russians every single day.
Putin seems to have no bother, Paul, murdering his own people day after day for absolutely no reason at all. And the people there just seem to put up with it. I know we've spoken before about the penny drop moment where there'd be an internal revolt. There's no sign of that happening, is there?
Well, there's 400 people arrested over the last day for wanting to go out and mourn Navalny. I don't know when the tipping point will be. I don't know how much longer the people of Russia are just going to accept that, that is their state system and do almost nothing about it. The former president of Estonia quote tweeted me today, and I'd shared this tweet about this day 10 years ago, and the intense battles that we were talking about earlier on, and President Ilves quote tweeted it, and he said, Russians, we can't go out and protest because we'll be arrested by Putin's police. And then Ukrainians, semicolon, like, look at the difference, right? And I was describing earlier on, both the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, they were events that we were compelled to undertake because it was the right thing to do. I don't know what the tipping point is of Russians standing up and doing something against the criminal mafia regime that is in the Kremlin right now. But the first article that I wrote, in this phase of the war, the full-scale war, was on the 26th of February, 2 days into what changed everything. And I made 2 predictions there. And I said, number one, the number of Russian losses is going to be enormous. Number 2, that will be the catalyst, finally, for a movement that will dethrone Putin, that will get him out of the Kremlin, either in a box or in handcuffs or, whichever way it works, right? I was not only right about the first part, about the massive Russian losses, I underestimated it. I did not think that it could possibly get to anything like the number that it is, 400,000 dead. But the second one still hasn't happened. They still haven't stood up. Maybe. The arrests, the clampdowns over people laying flowers at a memorial to Navalny, I don't know whether that's going to be what is finally going to be the tipping point for them. But they need to do it. They need to remove the thieving tyrants that have been looting their country for the last 2 years. It's down to Ukraine, with Western support, to crush the Russian military, to deliver a humiliating defeat to Vladimir Putin. And then it's down to Russians to decide how they deal with him and how they deal with his, not just his oligarchs and the rest of the billionaires that are associated and linked to him, but the entire criminal system that state operates under. We see the police going out and happily, crashing skulls with their batons, which they tried to do to us on Maidan as well, and we stood firm against it. But the reason why the police do that is not just because they enjoy the violence, although, they're sadistic bastards, and they probably do. But the police are a part of the rotten, corrupt system as well. They're all on the take. And so for them, it's not just we have to stop people from gathering and laying flowers. We have to stop this challenge to our livelihoods. That's their calculation. Don't know. But that's Russia's problem.
And I read your most recent article, Paul, in the Byline Times about our buddy Boris Johnson sticking his nose into things again.
Well, when I tweeted it, I said that's a rare thing for me, right? Normally when I write, I have an idea. It's my concept. My notes for my next article are right here. I'll be sitting here and I'll just jot out a few things. But the executive editor of Byline messaged me and he said, have you seen Johnson's endorsement of Trump and do you want to write about it? So when I tweeted it, I'm like, it's rare for me that I write something that I'm asked to write. But yeah, Trump, Johnson, Putin, this alignment, yeah, that's a subject that I can write on. And, what I wrote there is what Johnson said was that he believed that he believed that Trump would stand up to Putin and assist Ukraine in winning. And what I wrote there is Trump has never stood up to Putin. Trump will not stand up to Putin, and Trump cannot stand up to Putin. Because what the article did was described in verifiable details. I mean, these are known knowns, right? I just finished reading a book, actually, Collusion by the Guardian journalist Luke Harding. These are known knowns of Russia's deliberate, direct, and bold and open interference in the 2016 election. Trump is owned by Putin, and he knows it. And that's not the only compromising material. The fact of the election support, that's not the only compromising material that they have on Trump either. There's all kinds of blackmail that they've got on him.
Well, the danger, Paul, is that if they know someone is for sale, and Trump is for sale all of the time, are you worried about the US election this year?
We all should be worried about the idea that Donald Trump, having been found liable for the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll and being ordered to pay $83 million in damages to her, and then on top of that, the $355 million New York fraud case with $100 million in interest on top of that as well, and him being banned from being involved in business in New York for the next 3 years. It's horrifying that there is a realistic chance that person, that character, might again become the president of the United States of America. Everybody should be fearful of that eventuality and the mindset that leads to it. I mean, there's a debate that Joe Biden is old. We know he's old. That's a matter of fact, right? And his delivery is sometimes a little bit slow, in part because of his age, in part because he's had a lifelong stammer, and that's who he is. But at the same time, he's a decent, honest, and competent man who has not only been the international statesman that the United States needed post-Trump, but what he's done domestically as well with infrastructure, with fixing prices on insulin, which my mum was dependent on before she passed away as well. Like his record on jobs growth is stellar. It's incredible. The most jobs created by any president, I think, in the last, however many decades, whatever it is. His record is there, and he's standing against a criminal. A criminal. There's a documentary. It's a PBS documentary. It's about 2 hours, 20 minutes. And I recommend that you or anybody listening to this watches this. And it's called Democracy on Trial. And it lays out the multiple strategies that Trump was attempting to employ to overturn the will of the people. You know, I mean, the people who defend Trump say, you know, he was standing up for democracy, he wanted to investigate election fraud and all the rest of it. The opposite is true. He was trying to overturn democracy. There was no election fraud. It was invented, and they knew that they'd invented it. And that is why Fox and others who lied about this repeatedly, Fox was ordered to pay $750 million to Dominion voting systems, right? I mean, you know, they had 60 court challenges where they could attempt to present evidence of voter fraud, and they couldn't win any one of those cases because they had no evidence. And those cases are still to come for Trump. The election fraud case, the various other things that he had. There's 91 charges outstanding against this man. Yes, everyone should be fearful that he might possibly become the president of the United States of America.
And as you say, he's a crook in plain sight, and the idiots still seem to want him.
It's a cult.
Yeah, it's a big cult.
Yeah.
The 24th of February, Paul, next Saturday, there's a march in Cork City that starts at 2:30 from the Grand Parade, and it goes on to 3:30. So I'm asking anyone who's listening to join me and all of our Ukrainian friends and do that march. And I'm sure in Dublin it's happening likewise. What about you, Paul? What's the spirit of people like as we hit 2 years of this awful, awful war?
The spirit of the people is determined. I saw a video today, Greg, and it was in one of the towns that Russia had occupied in the early phases of the war. I think it was in Chernivtsi, which is to the north of Ukraine. It borders with Belarus. It was a line of people. The adults were all blindfolded. They had white cloth tied around their head. Everyone was wearing a white armband, and they'd been tied up on a piece of string, and they were being led to a basement where the Ukrainian commentary said they will be held in this cold basement without food, without water for almost the next month. And it's just regular civilian families with their kids, Greg. That is what Russian occupation means. It means you are going to be treated less than human. Though this video release was new, this was the first time that I'd seen this today, and it's particularly shocking because of the number of kids who are in it as well. These things are not a surprise to us. You know, after a decade of war in total and 2 years of the full-scale war, we know that that's what Russians do, and they do everywhere. You know, if this is my final word, Lifeline Ukraine is dealing with the psychological repercussions of what this phase of the war has entailed. And, you know, we've done training, we've organized training sessions for my colleagues so that they have the best expert knowledge on how to encounter certain situations or how to help in certain situations that we know that we're encountering on the hotline. And one of the ones that we've done in the second part of 2022 was helping people who have been victims of sexual violence at the hands of these Russian occupiers. The training course that we did yesterday was how we better understand and how we support people who've been prisoners in Russian occupied areas, because they're all being tortured. They're all being tortured. And that's what Russian occupation means. And that's why it has to end on every single square centimeter of Ukrainian soil. And your question was about the spirit as we come up to the awful second anniversary of the full-scale invasion. The spirit here is absolutely determined. We will not allow those monsters to torture and murder any Ukrainian citizen on any part of Ukrainian soil. And that includes Crimea as well. If you look at what they've been doing in the decade of occupation of Crimea, Russia is a brutal totalitarian state at home. Of course they're doing that in any land that they occupy as well. Of course they are. And more so and more brutally to people who are objecting to their occupation. The peninsula of Crimea, the indigenous population is the Crimean Tatars. And their communities have been subjected to a decade of the same thing, of forced disappearances, of politically motivated, trumped-up charges and banana court rulings that have sentenced them to years behind bars in filthy Russian prisons. It all must end. The occupation of all Ukrainian territory has to come to an end, and the spirit of the people is 100% determination that is when the war ends.
Your friend who said, make sure Paul comes to this meeting, why did you say that?
You'd have to ask her. I can speculate. I've done a lot of writing over the years, broadcasting, talking with people like yourself. When I'm generously invited to podcasts to share my thoughts about what's happening here, I care about Ukraine. I care very much about people understanding the origin and the causes of the war since 2014. And, again, one of the reasons why some media commentators get it wrong is because they simply don't understand it enough. And so, my job has been to help explain that. And, when people talk about 2014, if they're not intimately aware of what happened, they say, the annexation of Crimea, full stop. That's the end of the sentence. Well, they didn't just annex Crimea in 2014. The Russians began a hot war, a land war in the Donbass, and that claimed tens of thousands of lives. Arguably, that was the bigger crime of 2014. Although, the annexation is clearly illegal and obviously very, very essential for the world order for us to reverse it. But, I've written a lot about the war, and initially Lifeline Ukraine was established to support the veterans who've been fighting in the Donbass since 2014. And, Uliana, who was the acting minister at the time, she knows I care about those things. She knows as a business person in the past, I'm, I guess, a competent enough guy to be able to do a thing. If I'm given a task, then, I should be able to implement it. And this was a big ask. This was a big ask. But like I said earlier on, I understood how it was important and the impact that our work would have. And okay, so that's what I did.
I think she saw your heart, Paul, and she knows you're a guy to get things done. And I was asking about the spirit of the people over there. How about your spirit?
Greg, I have good days and not so good days. And I think that can be said for all of us. Depends on the flow of things. It depends on what's happening. Every time we hit the milestone of another 10,000 dead Russian invaders, I post my happy dance photo. That photo. There's a guy who's standing in the background there. He's playing the role. We're in a nightclub. The photo is a still from a birthday video that we recorded. A group of us recorded for a friend of ours, right? And the idea was like we're in a nightclub and we're dancing to rap music and everything else, which is why I'm dressed the way that I'm dressed. But there's a guy standing in a dark suit in the background, and he's wearing sunglasses. He's playing the role of the bouncer in the nightclub. And I won't mention his name because I don't talk about this kind of things, but he later became one of Ukraine's ambassadors overseas.
Oh, dear.
I mean, he's in that photo as well. When there's news to celebrate that is significant, I can have a good day. When we're constantly exposed to the images of destruction, they're harder days. When my city is attacked, I love this city. And, the attacks of the previous week, not the last week, but the week before, killed 5 people in Kyiv. And that's hard because I know what these people are. These are decent, ordinary, hardworking people who are doing their best to figure out life, right? As we all are, through the challenges, through whatever we're going through personally, professionally, whatever it is. That is who these people are. They're trying to build homes, they're trying to build families, they're trying to build careers. And 5 of them had their lives ended just like that a week ago. That's hard to take because I know who these people are, because I know the nature of this society, of the values of this society. These are good and decent people murdered in their beds, asleep. But, the Russian missile attacks always come early morning hours, 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, when people are in bed or just getting up to get their coffee to get them going for the day. It's awful, but at the end of the day, Ukraine will win, and I will be here for that. And that's going to be glorious. The point that the Russian army is defeated and capitulates, that will be an incredible, incredible day. And I'm very much looking forward to the party that follows.
I hope I'll be there to enjoy that part with you, Paul. Whenever it happens, it feels like we're in this now for the long haul, and try to keep your spirits up. I think a huge thank you for reminding all of the listeners that we need to welcome any Ukrainian refugees to this country of ours. Look after them. I absolutely guarantee you this is not a place where they want to be. They would like to be back in Ukraine, at home, with all of their loved ones, enjoying life there. Please don't listen to any conversations anywhere about the need for money in Ukraine. It needs every single shilling it can have and more again. And if you can get out on the 24th and march somewhere, or go to your local church and say a prayer, I don't care. Paul, thank you so much.
Greg, it's always a pleasure chatting to you. I'll leave you with just one last little story. One of my colleagues at Lifeline Ukraine, Sasha, he sent his family to overseas, and they ended up in Ireland for a while. And he was telling me recently that they'd returned because his daughter was pregnant. Now he has a new granddaughter. And they returned because they wanted the child to be born in Ukraine, right? And when they christened my colleague's granddaughter, the godfather that they chose was the host family that had looked after them in Ireland. And I want to thank everybody who has opened their hearts and their homes to Ukrainians, especially in Ireland as my home country, but everywhere. Thank you very much, Greg.
That's what good people do, Paul, and you're a good man and you're saving a lot of lives out there. Keep waving that flag and digging in, even though it hurts. Thank you so much.
All the very best.
Good man yourself. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.